Buses are a-comin', oh yes. Buses are a-comin', oh yes. Buses are...
There are many areas of the United States where there is no prejudice whatsoever. Negroes are continuously making progress here in this country. The progress in many areas is not as fast as it should be, but they are making progress, and we will continue to make progress. There's no reason that in the near and the foreseeable future that a Negro could also be president of the United States.
Listening to Kennedy's speech today, you may think he was a prophet. However, given the events that occurred in the weeks before his speech, his prediction of a Negro president sounded preposterous. A 1946 Supreme Court ruling prohibited segregated seating on interstate buses and trains. An expanded ruling in 1960 prohibited segregation in bus and train terminals. In the spring of 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, known as the Corps, launched the Freedom Rides. Their goal was to challenge the South's outdated Jim Crow laws and the region's non-compliance with the Supreme Court rulings. The Freedom Rides was a way for civil rights leaders to draw national attention to the unfairness of segregation and challenge the federal government to enforce the law. The plan was for 13 riders, black and white, to board 2 buses in Washington, D.C., and travel through the southern states all the way to New Orleans, behaving as if the Supreme Court rulings were being upheld. Corps conducted intensive training with the riders, teaching them the Gandhian principles of nonviolent direct action. The 13 Freedom Riders set out on 2 buses.
I'm on my way, to freedom land. I'm on my way, to freedom land. I'm on my way.
The rides were uneventful until the Freedom Riders reached South Carolina. John Lewis and another rider were beaten when they tried to enter the whites-only waiting room. On May 13th, the riders reached Atlanta. They met with Martin Luther King Jr., who told a journalist traveling with the riders, "You will never make it through Alabama." King thought it was unwise to continue. The Freedom Riders ignored King's warning. When the first bus reached Anniston, Alabama, the KKK attacked the bus with iron pipes and slashed the tires. The bus left the terminal and the tires blew out. The KKK surrounded the bus and threw a firebomb into it. Miraculously, the Freedom Riders got out before the gas tank exploded. When the second bus carrying Freedom Riders arrived in Anniston, the KKK boarded the bus and beat up the riders. The Klan members stayed on the bus as it headed to Birmingham, Alabama. In a secret agreement with the head of the Klan, the Birmingham police chief, Bull Connor, intentionally kept his officers away for 15 minutes to allow the KKK time to beat up the Freedom Riders. Bull Connor, like many others in the South, would do anything to ensure that the social order of the South remained intact, and maintaining segregation of races was an essential part of this.
Now, the interesting thing is, whites in the South didn't hate blacks if they stayed in their place. What did surprise me was the depth of hatred towards any whites that supported it. And we were traitors to our race. And so the vehemence of the hatred towards the white Freedom Riders was, I was surprised at the extent of that.
When the Freedom Riders entered the bus terminal in Birmingham, instant chaos broke out. As planned, by the time the police had arrived, the Klansmen were gone. Dramatic images of violence in Alabama were reported in the media around the world. This was a source of embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. There was a certain amount of hypocrisy in all of this. President Kennedy was working to spread freedom around the world, while in the U.S., black people were denied basic rights. The violence in Anniston and Birmingham convinced Corps to abandon the Freedom Rides. Diane Nash felt it was important to continue the Freedom Rides and called for a wave of new riders. 10 riders were chosen and they split into 2 groups.
We made out our wills before we left Nashville. Those of us who continued the Freedom Rides, we were anticipating the worst.
When the first group reached Birmingham, Bull Connor would not let the Freedom Riders exit the bus. He put them in jail for their own protection. Later that day, Bull Connor arranged for the riders to be taken from jail and transported to the Tennessee state line. They were let out on the side of the road and told to take a train back to Nashville. Instead, the riders headed back for Birmingham. When they arrived, the second group of Nashville riders were already there. The KKK harassed the riders. The bus drivers were afraid and refused to transport the riders. Kennedy told Governor Patterson if he would not protect the riders and end this crisis, the federal government would step in. The governor provided protection and escorted the riders to Montgomery. When the riders arrived at the Montgomery bus station, a mob viciously attacked reporters and the Freedom Riders. The police just watched, providing no protection for the riders. After these attacks, Robert Kennedy realized he could not count on the Alabama authorities to protect the riders, and he arranged for federal marshals to go to Alabama. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders held a meeting at a church in Montgomery. These leaders were originally against the Freedom Rides, however, they now pledged their support. During the meeting, a white angry mob surrounded the church. They threw rocks at the windows and overturned a car and lit it on fire. Fearing for their safety, Martin Luther King called Robert Kennedy from inside the church to ask for federal protection.
This announcement that the city is now under martial law and troops are on the way into Montgomery.
News of the event in Alabama spread all over the world. Robert Kennedy addressed the crisis in a radio broadcast stating that while prejudice exists in the country, Negroes are making progress.
Buses are a-comin', oh yes, better get you ready, oh yeah.
The governor of Mississippi promised there would be no violence in his state. When the Freedom Riders arrived at the bus station in Jackson, they were asked to leave. When they refused the order, they were arrested and sent to jail on breach of peace charges. The governor and the Kennedys felt that the arrest would stop the movement. In fact, it did the opposite. To end the crisis, Kennedy asked the ICC to issue a desegregation order to enforce the Supreme Court decision. Kennedy informed the Freedom Riders of his request. He tells them, "The signs will eventually come down, so for your safety, stop the rides."
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna...
On September 22nd, almost 6 months after the Freedom Rides began, the ICC issued a formal desegregation order. The Freedom Rides brought together people of different races, religions, cultures, and philosophies from across the country. They were soldiers in a nonviolent war confronting an unjust system.
The theory is that if you're going to bring about social change, you have to have the sympathy, if not the active support, of the majority of people. The Freedom Rides was the first major movement that brought large numbers of whites in the Deep South to express their discontent with the segregated system.
It was a clear-cut decision for me to go and try to work for racial justice.
The Freedom Rides proved that the Gandhian principles of nonviolence could be effective in the civil rights movement. The people who were beaten did not strike back, and they did not give up when faced with violence. Their nonviolence was a stark contrast to the violence shown by segregationists. Their courage left a deep impression on the nation and the rest of the world. Through the media, the Freedom Riders gained a sympathetic national and international audience. This in turn put pressure on the federal government to enforce the law. The Freedom Riders' peaceful efforts for change in the face of violence were one of the great successes of the civil rights movement.
One of the factors in Obama being elected was the Freedom Rides, that we kind of helped move racial justice forward enough so that would happen.
The success of the Freedom Rides spurred civil rights activists to push for more social justice. As a result, the Kennedy administration increased their efforts to bring about change. In a 1963 speech to the American people, President Kennedy voiced his support for a comprehensive civil rights bill, calling it a moral issue facing the nation. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 officially overturned state Jim Crow laws, finally ending legally enforced segregation as a way of life. In May of 1961, the Freedom Riders started a revolution for social justice. They set out on a journey to change the world. And they did.